Thank you, Madam Secretary. Senator Hagerty.
Thank you, Chairman Van Hollen. Before I get into my line of questioning, I just want to clarify on the debt ceiling piece. Secretary Yellen, do you think it's not possible to negotiate in any respect the spending package that's been put forward? Is it possible to set aside and agree that our nation's debts will be paid, that we'll pay the interest on our debt, and set that component aside and agree to that before we get to any discussion on specific spending reductions?
I'm not sure exactly what you're suggesting here. President Biden has indicated that he is more than willing to discuss an appropriate path for spending and taxes and the overall deficit, that it's important to have a fiscally responsible budget plan, and that these are certainly appropriate matters for discussion between the White House and Democrats and Republicans in the Congress.
Indeed.
He looks forward to doing that, but not under the specter of destroying the country's economic and financial.
I think the specter that's being presented is a false choice. And the specter that you present does not have to be that. We are facing an unprecedented spending epidemic. We're in a deficit spending situation. We have $31 trillion of debt moving higher that we're parking on the backs and the shoulders of our children. If we don't address it in a responsible manner ourselves, the capital markets will address it eventually, and I think that'll be far more catastrophic. So we have to find a way to talk about this that doesn't pit ourselves with this doom and gloom scenario, and that we find a way to actually address the...
Senator Hagerty, President Biden has submitted to Congress a budget that has, over the next decade, $3 trillion of deficit reduction. It invests in our workforce, in our economy.
And it massively increases taxes at a time when we're trying to recover our
supply.
economy. It's a non-starter on both sides of the aisle, as you know, Madam Secretary. Let me get back to the questions that I wanted to entertain with you, though, today. As I mentioned in my opening statement, I've been tracking the Silicon Valley and Signature Bank situation in very close detail. The situation was caused by a remarkable set of failures, in particular the Silicon Valley Bank situation, failures of management, failures of Fed oversight, and failures of how we responded to it. Both President Biden and in your opening remarks just a few minutes ago, you unequivocally stated that no losses will be borne by the taxpayer for the actions that have been taken by the Fed, the Treasury, and the FDIC, and guaranteeing that all insured deposits at Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank that followed the failed auction of SVB, that none of those will be borne by the taxpayer. I understand why that claim is politically appealing, but it's impossible to square with how these programs actually work. As you know, the systemic designation used in the guarantee of SVB and Signature Bank's deposits relies on the FDIC's Federal Deposit Insurance Fund, which will be replenished in the case of a loss with a special assessment on banks across the nation, which inevitably will be passed along to all bank customers, which last time I checked were American taxpayers. So as we saw with Signature Bank, the estimated cost to the Deposit Insurance Fund for this resolution alone is $2.5 billion, which will be paid for by fees assessed to banks across the nation. Is that correct?
There will be a special assessment too. So it's only an estimate, the $2.5 billion. We don't really know what the final cost
I understand.
will
I think
be, but there will be a special
If you add SVB, it's going to become much, much larger. And when you increase the cost of doing business, that cost is going to get passed on to customers. So this number, $2.5 billion plus, and any future losses will be in fact borne by bank customers across the United States. Again, American taxpayers, the last time I checked. Is that correct?
Well, they may be borne by shareholders of the firms.
I think the fees tend to be passed on to the consumers. I'd like to turn to news reports yesterday that Treasury is considering whether the administration can order an unprecedented expansion of FDIC coverage to guarantee all uninsured deposits. As was reported, this facility would be backed by the Exchange Stabilization Fund, which was created to support the value of the U.S. dollar in international markets, not as a slush fund when consulting Congress may be inconvenient. I'm deeply concerned by these reports, as such a program would not only constitute a misuse of the ESF, but it would circumvent Congress's role in approving such an action. So, Madam Secretary, does ensuring every deposit at every FDIC-insured bank in the nation over $250,000 require congressional approval?
This is not something that we have looked at. It's not something that we're considering. All that I have said is that when the failure of a bank is judged by supermajorities of the FDIC board, the Fed board, and myself in consultation with the president, when such a failure is deemed to create systemic risk, which I think of as the risk of a contagious bank run, that we are likely to invoke the systemic risk exception, which permits the FDIC to protect all depositors, and that would be a case-by-case determination.
I understand,
I
and
have
that-
not considered or discussed anything having to do with blanket insurance or guarantees of all deposits.
2 points, Madam Secretary. One, I would encourage you, if you do consider something broader than the basic $250,000, to remind you that congressional approval is required of that in the form of a joint resolution. Two, the program that you just stated really suggests to many people in America, certainly people in my home state, that there's a two-tier system of insurance here in America. For those that are deemed to be systemically important at the time, and those that are not. I think many Tennessee banks are concerned that they would not be deemed
I would
systemically
disagree
important,
with
and that
that,
is
Senator
concerning.
Hagerty, and I said explicitly in remarks I gave yesterday to the American Bankers Association, which is mainly consists of community banks, that this is not a question of invoking it for large or medium-sized banks, only that the failure of a small bank, of a community bank, could likewise trigger a run on other banks and lead to the same judgment that the failure of that community bank creates
I
systemic
think
risk.
more clarity here would be appreciated. Thank you. And I want to turn to one more point that you and I have discussed on a number of times before in a very short period of time that I have. This has to do with the ProPublica leak of taxpayer information. We've met now, this is the fourth time you and I have met about this. The fact is that ProPublica was a leaker of, or somebody at the IRS, or somehow ProPublica has leaked confidential taxpayer information. It's been nearly 2 years since this occurred. Has anyone been held to account?
I'm as frustrated by this situation as you are. I would love to know who's responsible for that. And I'm afraid that I know no more about this than I did when the leak first occurred. We did what I believe is the appropriate thing, which is to refer this matter to independent investigators, the Treasury Inspector General, the IRS Inspector General, and the Department of Justice. And there are
no
three
reports?
independent investigations that follow their own timelines, and I can't tell you when they're going to be concluded. I would suggest that you ask those investigators when they think it might be concluded. I would really like to get a report, and I think this was a very serious matter and deserves an independent and thorough investigation.
It damages the confidence of taxpayers in America.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. As I said at the outset, the Appropriations Committee has a new chair, and I'm pleased that she's joining us